Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. It was a hot and sunny Saturday morning when I decided to head over to the clothing optional beach near my house. I had discovered this secluded spot a few years back and enjoyed the freedom and relaxation of sunbathing au naturel. The beach regulars were a friendly, non-judgmental bunch who appreciated the privacy the shoreline offered. Families with kids stuck to the main beach nearby, leaving this little cove to those who like to swim and soak up the rays in the buff. I parked my car in the small gravel lot and trekked my way through the sea oats and sand dunes, eager to claim my favorite spot before the crowds arrived. As I crested a dune, the expanse of glistening blue-green water came into view. At this early hour, only a smattering of beachgoers were present, mostly couples strolling hand in hand. I set up my towel, stripped down to my birthday suit, and settled in for some peaceful tanning time. After about an hour, I took a refreshing dip in the calm waters. As I emerged, walking back to my spot, I noticed a woman had set up nearby. She had on a large floppy hat and oversized sunglasses, but was otherwise dressed in a conservative one-piece. I nodded a polite hello and resumed my previous position. Maybe 15 minutes later, I heard angry footsteps approaching. "How dare you expose yourself like this?" the woman shouted. I looked up, startled to see her standing over me, hands on her hips and scowl on her face. It was the same woman from before. "I'm sorry, is there a problem?" I asked, taken aback. "You're darn right there's a problem," she spat. "No one wants to see that." She gestured in disgust at my nude body. I stammered, "Well, I'm pretty sure this is a clothing-optional beach." She cut me off. "Don't try to justify your behavior, I'm calling the police." And with that, she stomped away, whipping out her cell phone. I sat there stunned for a moment before shaking my head and trying to resume my relaxation. However, I couldn't shake the nervous pit in my stomach. About 10 minutes later, I heard sirens and saw a police cruiser pulling into the small lot. My heart sank. 2 officers approached, the woman trailing behind them with a smug look on her face. "That's him, officer!" she cried, pointing at me. The police requested my ID and asked me to explain the situation. I politely provided my information and recounted the brief interaction with the woman, explaining that I was following proper etiquette in this clothing-optional zone. The woman, who I'll call Karen from here on out, then launched into a tirade about how I was exposing myself in a vulgar manner and her distress at being subjected to such indecency. The officers listened patiently before informing Karen that no laws were being broken. As they turned to leave, she became irate. "You can't let him get away with this," she bellowed. "I demand you arrest this creep." One of the officers calmly replied, "Ma'am, this portion of the beach allows for clothing optional use. I suggest you move further down if this offends you." Karen was having none of it. She continued her shrill complaints, insisting I was a pervert and menace to society. The officer stood firm that I had done nothing criminal. Finally fed up, Karen pointed at me and screamed, "He touched me inappropriately!" I was floored by this blatant fabrication, but the officers had to investigate further now. "Is this true, sir? Did you touch or approach this woman?" "Absolutely not," I insisted. I went on to explain I had been lying on my towel this whole time, not even standing up. Other beachgoers must have overheard the commotion because a few came over unprompted to give statements in my defense. "This man did nothing wrong," an older gentleman asserted. "He kept to himself the whole time until that woman started harassing him." A nearby couple also attested that I had not moved from my spot at all. Karen seemed nervous now that there were witnesses contradicting her story. She tried backpedaling, but it was too late. Her lies were exposed. The officers promptly told Karen she could be charged for making false allegations. As they moved to escort her away, she became unhinged. "You idiots! You're all going to pay for this!" she shrieked. And with that, she grabbed a handful of sand and hurled it at me, bellowing incoherently. I shielded my face, but she kept advancing and began bombarding me with shells and debris from the beach, all while wailing hysterically. The officers had to physically restrain her. I was so stunned I couldn't even react. The officers forcibly removed Karen from the beach, assuring me they would charge her with assault and making false reports. I retrieved my things and went home still in disbelief at this insane turn of events. The next day I called the police station to follow up on the situation. Sure enough, Karen had been arrested for attacking me and falsifying a report. I decided right then to press full charges against this deranged woman. There was no telling how far she would have escalated the situation if the police hadn't intervened. At the hearing, the judge was appalled at Karen's actions, especially the completely fabricated accusations she tried to use against me. With the testimony from officers and witnesses backing me up, it was a quick open and shut case. She was found guilty of assault and given jail time, probation, and mandatory counseling. I was granted a restraining order against her as well. I'm still shaken up by what this unhinged woman tried to do to me, but I'm thankful justice was served in the end. The supportive beach community has reassured me that Karen was an outlier, and I won't let one lunatic ruin what should be a peaceful, relaxing environment for all. But from now on, I'll be keeping an eye out for any suspicious Karens lurking around. The next one is a pro-revenge story. My friend, I'll call her Sandy, worked at a travel agency in British Columbia, Canada. It was a small, owner-operated business with the owner and 3 employees, including my friend. Everyone worked Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. One of my friend's co-workers, I'll call her Jane, an older woman in her early to mid-60s, was a longtime nuisance employee. Among other sketchy behavior, Jane was always scamming ways to take time off over and above her official paid vacation time. In order to make up for the lost hours, she would claim overtime hours, pay by supposedly going into the office in her off hours to finish up work without being requested by the owner to do so. Despite being caught in her own lies on several occasions and being warned about trying to claim unsanctioned overtime, the owner of the travel agency was reluctant to officially reprimand Jane or get rid of her. The reason being is the owner discovered after she had hired Jane that Jane had actually been fired from her previous job at another local travel agency for pulling the same stunts. However, Jane had sued her former employer for unfair dismissal and had won a settlement. After a few years of my friend Sandy working at the travel agency, the owner was ready to retire and offered to sell the business to my friend. Sandy took her up on the deal and took over the business while keeping Jane and the other employee. Once again, just as the previous owner was afraid to get rid of Jane, so was Sandy for fear of being sued. When Sandy took over the business, she instituted guidelines regarding taking time off, and she established an official no overtime policy. Jane would still try with her shenanigans, but was far less successful in getting what she wanted with my friend in charge. However, Jane still had one trick up her sleeve when she wanted to take time off on a whim. Sandy was a divorced single mom of 2 boys who were heavily involved in youth hockey. She would sometimes leave the office an hour or 2 before closing to get her boys to hockey practice or a game. In order to avoid requesting in person and potentially being denied, Jane would wait for Sandy to be out of the office to book a day off if she didn't feel like coming into work or had made plans. Sandy would then arrive at work the next morning only to discover that Jane wasn't coming in. Despite this happening a number of times, Sandy would usually let it slide since there was now a definite no overtime policy. Therefore, Jane could no longer claim to come in to work on the weekend or after hours to try and make up for the day off. She would either miss out on a day's pay, in turn saving Sandy money as the owner, or it would come out of her remaining paid vacation days. Moreover, 2 people in the office at one time could usually handle everything. Jane not coming in was really a no-loss situation for Sandy. There was one time, however, when Sandy was going to be away for 1 or 2 work days just before the weekend to take her boys to a hockey tournament. She told both Jane and the other employee, both verbally and in writing, that they could not book time off for the dates in question, since she would be away and needed both of them in the office. Within a few days of giving this notice, Sandy went to the office on a Saturday to do some paperwork and go through the sales for the week. This is when she discovered that, only the day before, Jane had booked a trip for her daughter and son-in-law to Las Vegas, as well as a plane ticket in her name to Calgary where her daughter lived. Both the trip to Vegas and the ticket to Calgary coincided with the dates Sandy would be out of the office. Sandy then checked the vacation booking schedule to further discover that Jane had indeed booked the days off that she had expressly been told she couldn't have. Not mentioning she had discovered the travel Jane had booked for herself and her daughter, Sandy emailed Jane telling her she would have to deny her the days off since she had already been told they were unavailable because she, Sandy, would be away and needed Jane in the office. Through a continued series of email exchanges, Jane replied and outright lied to Sandy with some excuse about her daughter getting some long-awaited medical treatment or surgery, and she needed to go to Calgary to help out for a few days and look after her granddaughter. Sandy replied to this lie by telling Jane she knew about the trip she had booked to Vegas for her daughter and son-in-law, that Jane's trip to Calgary was most likely to babysit her granddaughter while her daughter was in Vegas, and that she would still have to deny Jane the days off, especially since she booked them after being told they were unavailable. Jane countered in her subsequent reply, without even addressing the fact that she had been caught in a lie, that she had been a dedicated employee of the travel agency for several years, and couldn't understand why she was being treated so unfairly after all she had done for the business. She then wrote that since she wasn't being treated as a valued employee, she had no choice but to retire, and was giving her 2 weeks' notice. Despite Jane's threat, Sandy replied that she would still be unable to grant her the days off and left it at that, without making any mention of Jane's threat to retire. Sandy then contacted her accountant, who also acted as her de facto business advisor, and explained what had happened with Jane. Also aware of Jane's previous shenanigans, Sandy's accountant told her that this was the out she had been looking for with Jane, and she had it all in writing. He told her that Jane had essentially resigned, retired, and all Sandy needed to do was honor Jane's desire to do so, let her finish out her 2 weeks, or pay her 2 weeks' wages in lieu with no further severance pay legally required since she hadn't been fired. The following Monday, Sandy went to the office early, accompanied by her long-term boyfriend to act as a witness. She put Jane's belongings from her desk into a box and took the things that were property of the business. Since Jane was old school and had resisted inputting client information in the computer database, this also included a small box filled with index cards that had client phone numbers, addresses, credit card information, and other personal information noted on them. In the meantime, the other employee had arrived for work, and they all waited for Jane to show up. Jane arrived just before 9 o'clock, acting as though nothing had happened, and greeted everyone with a "Good morning" as she walked through the door. However, she was apparently taken slightly aback when she noticed Sandy's boyfriend seated in the far corner of the office. At this point, Jane was midway to her desk when Sandy informed her that there was no need to go any further, and that she had accepted Jane's notification of retirement. She then handed Jane a check compensating her for the hours she had worked in the current pay period, as well as 2 weeks' wages in lieu of Jane finishing out her final 2 weeks before her retirement. Jane was dumbfounded and went into panic mode. "But I didn't retire! I'm not ready to retire!" Sandy responded that indeed she had retired, given her notice, and had proof of it in writing. All Jane could do was continue repeating, "But I didn't retire! I'm not ready to retire!" while unsuccessfully attempting to get the support of the other employee who refused to come to her defense. Sandy then pointed to the box containing Jane's belongings, wished her a happy retirement, and told her to leave the office. Jane quickly rifled through the box and noticed that the small box containing the index cards with client information was not there. She insisted that Sandy return it to her, which Sandy refused to do, explaining that it was property of the business, contained personal client information, and that she would be in violation of Canadian privacy laws if she were to let Jane take it. Jane's shock had now turned to obstinance, and she refused to leave without the box. Both the other employee and Sandy's boyfriend had started to get involved, repeatedly telling Jane to just leave. Sandy then informed Jane that if she didn't leave, they would have to call the RCMP, Canadian Police, at which point Sandy's boyfriend dialed police to inform the dispatcher of a disgruntled former employee at XYZ Travel Agency who was refusing to leave the premises. Within a few minutes, 2 police officers arrived, and Jane immediately ran to the door ranting about being fired and about the missing box of client info. To de-escalate the situation, one police officer told Jane to come outside and explain her side of the story. The other officer remained in the office to hear Sandy's side of the story, agreeing that Jane was not legally entitled to the box of client info. The other officer then re-entered the business and told Jane to wait outside. He said that Jane was insisting that Sandy was holding on to her personal belongings, namely a box of important information. Both Sandy and the officer who had spoken to her explained the contents of the box to the other officer, who in turn agreed it was not Jane's property. The police officers then picked up the larger box of Jane's personal belongings, took it outside to Jane, and told her she needed to go home. To rub salt in Jane's wounds the next day, Sandy put up a large sign in the window of the business congratulating Jane on her retirement, and even put a small announcement in the local newspaper doing the same thing. The icing on the piece of revenge cake was Sandy, when filling out the necessary government forms for when an employee quits, gets fired / retires, made sure to check the box labeled retired for the reason for Jane no longer being employed. By doing so, Jane was ineligible to collect unemployment insurance benefits. The next one is a petty revenge story. This happened back in 2013, but I just remembered it while talking to my mom the other day. For some context, this happened while my family was still living in Germany. My dad had just lost his job, which prompted us to look for less expensive housing options, and we moved from our relatively nice older apartment building to one of the prefabricated concrete ones in a different district. I was 9, so I didn't care too much about the aesthetics of the building, and I was thrilled about the fact that we now had direct access to a courtyard and cement pathways that I could ride my bike on. While my parents were still unpacking, some of the kids from down the hall came to our door and asked if I wanted to ride bikes with them, which became our weekend routine for a while. It only stopped when an old lady from the same side of the hall made a complaint about us being in the courtyard. Not that we were being loud or vulgar, just that we were present. Mind you, all of the apartments on our side of the hall faced the road, which was entirely opposite to the courtyard we used, so she couldn't even see us when we were outside. She sold it to my parents as looking out for other tenants, and claimed that people had complained to her specifically about how they were worried about walking in the courtyard while there were a couple of kids on bikes in the general area. My parents pretty much ignored her and just told me to play with my friends on one of the nearby streets. No idea why they thought this was a safe alternative. But none of us wanted to do that since we couldn't practice bike tricks on the road. About a week after I ignored her complaint, I had stayed out past the time I was meant to be home and left my bike around the side of the building so I could get it in the morning. However, as you might have guessed at this point, I woke up the next day to find my bike missing. I, being a dramatic little kid, ran up the stairs to our hall sobbing and told my parents what had happened. Apparently, the old lady told my parents that she had taken the bike from outside because we were still in the courtyard, and they were mad at me for not going to the street like they asked. They then told me to go down the hall and politely ask for the bike back, which I did. Unfortunately, the old lady told me that I needed to be taught a lesson, and if I gave her a written apology, yes, actually, I could have it back at the end of the week. It was Sunday morning. I was, of course, pissed, and started to plot my at the time brilliant revenge. The morning of next Saturday rolled around, and I was ready to put my plan in motion. I had put on a pretty good show of being remorseful to my mom, who lent me some money to buy a tin of biscuits to apologize with. I had my written apology, the biscuits, and several Voblas in a sandwich bag I had hidden in my coat. For those who have never heard of Vobla, it is a salted, dried fish popular in Russia, and that I personally think is one of the worst smells, maybe ever. My mom is Russian and loves them, which is why we had so many in the apartment. I knocked on the old lady's door, and she invited me in to put the things down. She accepted my letter and the biscuits, and I asked her if I could use her bathroom before I left with my bike, which she allowed. While she was sitting in the living room, I was hustling quietly around her bathroom and bedroom, hiding one of those gross dried fish anywhere I thought she wouldn't look regularly. Stuck between pipes under the sink, stuffed under her giant wardrobe, and even thrown onto the top shelf of her closet. With the all-natural stink bombs deployed, I washed my hands and all but sprinted out of her apartment with my bike, thrilled with the stunt I managed to pull off. From what I overheard from discussions between the parents of my friends and me, the old lady complained to the landlord about the awful fish smell on several occasions. He was a total jerk who rarely did anything about tenant complaints, before she finally hired a company to come deep clean her apartment. She found and complained about the very old, very nasty fish, and actually moved out a couple of months later, although I'm not sure if that was due to the lasting effects of the fish incident or something else entirely. Of course, I feel bad about it now, but at the time I felt like the biggest, coolest genius known to man. I guess the moral of the story is not to confiscate bikes from vindictive kids, and don't ever try Vobla. Seriously, the next one is a malicious compliance story. I drive trucks, and I was doing a job that just wouldn't get done if everybody followed all the red tape. It's kind of the place where you sign all the paperwork stating you'll do it this way, but the reality is you can't. But that's fine because the paperwork is there just to protect the company from legal recourse. Now, I'm not saying we all did dangerous stuff, but you know it was just little things that made your work a little easier and more efficient. Well, all of a sudden the company started to enforce every policy. What really annoyed me, though, was that you never knew which policy they had decided to start enforcing until you got asked to see a manager and told you were being put on a performance review because you had been observed on CCTV. What was more annoying was the supervisors would report you for something petty, but then the next day be asking you, and expect you to do something that was far more dangerous and risky than the thing they reported you for. Things like, You'd be reported and put on a performance review for leaving your keys in the truck for a few minutes on Tuesday, but then on Thursday, you'd be expected to use a tail lift in a public area, with people walking under the lift with a 1-ton pallet on it. This despite the fact that the company policy states that tail lifts should only be used outside of store opening hours. So I started to follow the rules explicitly. My daily hours went from being around 10 to around 12 or 13, but my ultimate frustration came when they decided all PPE had to be signed out by upper management. Before this change, they had a cupboard full of stuff like gloves, high-vis jackets, and most importantly for this story, steel toe cap boots. If you needed something, you just asked a supervisor, and you'd have a new pair of boots within a few minutes. Well, on a Friday, I noticed my boots had broken, and the sole was separating from the boot. I left for work on Saturday morning, telling my wife that I would probably be coming home because I knew upper management only worked Monday to Friday, so no new PPE could be provided. Sure enough, after showing the supervisors and manager on duty my boots, they couldn't get me any. They spent about an hour trying to find me some, but eventually told me I would have to go home without pay. I told them that I've turned up to work and that I'm willing to work, but it's the company's responsibility to provide their staff with PPE, and that it isn't my fault if they can't provide any. After a while of refusing to back down, the manager went to call someone in the legal department. He returned saying I would be sent home for the weekend with full pay, and some new boots would be provided to me on Monday. What's more, one of the supervisors told me that I should tape the boot up with tape, and that if I didn't, he'd report me to upper management. I also put in a grievance about this conversation and said supervisor was suspended from duties involving other members of staff. The thing is, before the company started to get petty, on Saturday morning, I would have just set off for work 30 minutes earlier and got some cheap boots myself on the way to work, but they honestly eroded any goodwill I had left, and I was past the point of caring. I had a nice weekend though. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.